I've spoken again this morning with the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, who is on the ground in Washington meeting with his counterparts in the IMF and the G20. Coordinated international action is critical to the overall confidence equation in dealing with the global financial crisis.
The 2008 collapse of the US investment bank Lehman Brothers sent shockwaves around the world. There was a certain end-of-the-world feeling around, including in Australia.
As of today, the Australian government will guarantee all term wholesale funding by Australian banks operating in international credit markets to make sure that they have the best possible access to global capital in the future.
An initial combination of support for the banking system and the economy produced one of those rare moments of bipartisanship.
I refer to yesterday's announcement of measures by the Prime Minister, to which the opposition immediately offered bipartisan support.
A few days after this, opposition frontbencher Peter Dutton started to declare share purchases to the Parliament, starting with BHP shares on October 17, then Commonwealth Bank shares in November and December, then ANZ and Westpac shares as the new year rolled into January 2009. But it was his trading in late January 2009 which has sparked political controversy and government attacks this week. On January 23, 2009, Peter Dutton advised that he had bought more shares in National Australia Bank, Commonwealth Bank and Westpac. Just over a week later, on February 3, he advised he had sold Commonwealth Bank shares. 2 months later, he advised he had also sold ANZ and NAB shares. The controversy concerns the fact the day after he had bought shares in all three banks, the government announced $4 billion more support for the financial system.
Today, the government confirms that it will establish a $4 billion Australian business investment partnership with the 4 major Australian banks. These are extraordinary measures for extraordinary times, an unprecedented crisis demanding an unprecedented response.
The Australian Business Investment Partnership ultimately did not proceed. Having backed the initial move to bail out the economy and the banks in October, the coalition soured on the idea of more bailouts and economic stimulus as the months went by. It did not support either the $4 billion bank package or a $42 billion stimulus announced shortly afterwards.
Australia is one of the only 2 OECD countries without some form of explicit deposit insurance. What do they do about that? Nothing.
Fast forward to 2025 and Peter Dutton's GFC share trading has become part of the intense scrutiny on the man who may be Prime Minister. The week started with the government's big spending Medicare announcement of $8.5 billion to give everyone access to bulk billing. But the government seemed equally keen to link this to Peter Dutton's history as Health Minister, as it was to sell its benefits to average voters.
Peter Dutton tried to abolish bulk billing. He tried to cut $50 billion from hospitals. He tried to make people pay a fee when they went to the emergency departments.
By Tuesday, the government was trying to focus attention on other Peter Dutton issues.
So we're starting to see a picture of Peter Dutton that this is a guy who just doesn't care about Australians. He's prepared to cut their pay and cut their jobs, all in order to get himself elected. But there's a story that broke this morning that you may have seen, which shows that Peter Dutton is pretty good at looking after himself.
This was a news.com.au story documenting Dutton's GFC-era bank share transactions.
Peter Dutton, the records show, bought a substantial number of shares in 3 of Australia's leading 4 banks at a day when their share value was at a record low. So while the rest of the market was selling shares in the big banks, who was in there buying those shares but Peter Dutton? And that just happened to be the day before the Rudd government announced a multi-billion-dollar bailout for the banks.
Peter Dutton did not front the cameras for more than 24 hours to respond to the story, and by the time he did so yesterday, a separate story had appeared documenting his property transactions over a 30-year period.
But just to be very clear, there's no information that I've been privy to that influenced any decision about any share that I've bought. I've conducted myself with integrity. Why would I be declaring every detail if there was something that was to be hidden? It's just not.
Between the Medicare attack, the share story and the property story, a major assault on the opposition leader's credibility was unfolding.
I was there at that time and I saw the Australian economy on fire. There was one political leader who was not focused on the national interest. That political leader was focused on his own financial interest.
The problem with the share and property stories was that they didn't quite nail any wrongdoing, just raised some questions. The suggestion was that Dutton had bought the shares on the basis of insider knowledge that the $4 billion package was about to be announced. But no one had any proof, or to be blunt, any recollection of whether he actually knew about it. It remains the case that Mr Dutton has not directly answered the question of whether he was aware of the planned announcement.
It is common practice, though, for them to talk to the opposition about it. So Malcolm Turnbull was in charge at the time. Mr Turnbull didn't share the information with you?
I've been very clear. I've conducted myself with integrity my whole life. I've never made an investment decision based on insider information or insider knowledge.
There's a long history, almost a tradition, of our political leaders' business and financial dealings being scrutinised, on top of the usual name-calling. It's been slim pickings in the case of Anthony Albanese, a short-lived story about a rental property, and then his decision to buy a $4 million coastal home.
Prime Minister, what's wrong with Dutton making money out of property? Haven't you as well?
I make no comment about Peter Dutton's matters. That's a matter for him.
The Prime Minister's office was shopping this around last week, and they've shopped it to a number of journos. One's picked it up, but this is how the government operates, and they're throwing mud.
Throwing mud sometimes works if there's enough substance to raise questions in voters' minds. And there's a view in politics that building envy about someone's wealth will work against them, or at least undermine their public story. In this case, Dutton's story about being a Queensland copper from a humble background. But it comes at the cost of the most valuable asset in politics, oxygen. The best the government can say about this week is that people were talking about Peter Dutton, and not in a good way, and talking less about Chinese warships off the east coast. But it has been at the expense of selling the government's message on bulk billing and other policy announcements. Even before the official election campaign begins, it seems the government's biggest concern is the opposition leader, not its policy offerings to voters.